Welcome to this week's lecture on the Acts of the Apostles, or better known as Acts. The most important thing about Acts is very similar to the most important thing about the Gospel of Luke. The fact that Acts is a second volume and accompanies Luke, you can see that right there in the prelude, the first couple of verses. It addresses this whole book is addressed to Theophilus, just like the Gospel of Luke was. So it starts just the same way and basically says it's the second volume. So this is kind of the rest of the story, and this whole lecture is just I'm going to outline the book of Acts for you and kind of go through some of the major points, and then we'll come back with another video that talks about the themes of Acts. It's very important to do the reading for this week. Both Ehrman and Gail O'Day's section in the Women's Bible Commentary. Those are both important for the quiz. All the questions on the quiz really come from that. The Acts of the Apostles, if you want to look at characters, they have two main characters, and it's Peter and Paul. That's why you have this image here of Petrus to the left and Paulus to the right. Really, those are the two main characters in the gospel, outside of the fact that James still looms large as the leader of the church in Jerusalem. We find that out in chapter 15, or shortly thereafter, chapter 12. But Luke is a mediating voice, and it's important to kind of recognize that the same themes that were important in the gospel tend to be important here in Acts. So let's get into this broad outline. You'll see how I outlined it here. Chapters 1 and 2 is kind of the Acts is always a movement. So the first two chapters is a movement from Jesus to the Holy Spirit. Acts picks up the resurrection story and tells the story of Jesus ascending into heaven. And then chapter 2 deals with Pentecost. That's the painting from El Greco that you see. That's exactly what that is. And so there you have the same kind of Jesus that was in control in Luke is the same kind of Jesus that's in control in Acts. And the movement here is from the ascended Jesus to the Holy Spirit coming down from the heavens. It's also worth repeating that here it's in Jerusalem, unlike the rest of the Gospels. The disciples stay in Jerusalem, and that's where Jesus goes, ascends into heaven, and that's where the Holy Spirit descends from heaven. And that's really the beginning of the church. Gail O'Day says the Acts is the story of the church. It's what makes Acts unique in the New Testament. It's the only narrative in the New Testament that deals with the growth of the church from Jesus's ascension to Paul going to Rome. And like I said, it's all in movement. So you'll see that the first section again is from Jesus and the Holy Spirit. The second one is growth to persecution, then persecution to the movement to the Gentiles, and then from Gentiles to beyond in 13 through 28. So let's get a little bit more specific in these sections. Chapter 1 really does kind of re-narrate the ending of Luke. So it picks up exactly where the Gospel of Luke stops at the ascension of Jesus. It retells that story and then tells the story of the Holy Spirit. So I won't kind of rehash that. The next section it really kind of is an attempt to explain the growth of the early church. How did it grow, and how did it move? It's still within Jerusalem here, but this is a growth story. So the growth of the Jesus movement among Jews, and that's kind of the progression here, right? It goes, Jesus ascends in Jerusalem. The Holy Spirit comes to the disciples in Jerusalem. And then it's in Jerusalem that the gospel of Jesus Christ is spread, and is spread among Jews. And chapter 3 through 6 really kind of narrates that internal growth. Chapter 3 is Peter's first main sermon, or his main speech. Speeches are incredibly important in the Acts of the Apostles. you'll hear a lot of speeches. Peter makes several. Stephen makes one. Philip talks to the Ethiopian eunuch. Paul is full of speeches. And according to Ehrman, speeches make up 1/4 of the Acts of the Apostle. And what's important about these speeches is that these are the speeches. Luke wasn't there for a lot of these. I mean, the writer of Acts, Luke, wasn't there for many of these speeches. And so he's putting these speeches on their lips. And so these speeches tell you a lot about the way Luke thinks about the gospel and the spread of early Christianity. So Peter's speech in First Sermon is chapter 3. Chapter 4 is when Peter and John are arrested and questioned and released. And this is directly related to the sermon that Peter just preached. So you get, just like the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus would preach, there was always opposition and always acceptance. So you get the same thing here. Peter preaches, there are many who believe Peter, and then there's a lot of people who reject it, and that's why they're questioned by the religious leaders. So same kind of pattern in Acts as we had in Luke. Then chapter 5 gets into this really important story about Ananias and Sapphira holding back offerings. Luke tells that story where everybody's selling their possessions and living in common and taking care of each other, which is what we probably think was going on in some of those letters that Paul wrote early on. So Luke is trying to tell the truth about how the early movement went. But this story talks about how in those communities, you had to do right by the community. You had to be ethical, especially related to money. And Ananias and Sapphira is just one story that gives you an idea of Luke and Acts ethics around money. That it comes up over and over and over again. And so this is part of Luke's social consciousness. You can't withhold money from the community because you're robbing from God, basically. So the story of Ananias and Sapphira is about them withholding some of their offering and God striking them dead. That's how serious Luke is about justice issues related to money and poverty in community. So chapter 5, 1 through 11 is important in that. And then 12 through 14, it kind of springboards kind of this internal critique of the community to all these signs and wonders that were done by these early Jesus followers. And that helped spread the good news, but it also created anger within the religious establishment. Again, that pattern of, once somebody preaches the gospel, there's some acceptance, but also rejection. And that rejection ends up turning into persecution. Chapter 6, 1 through 7 is important because it talks about this internal dispute among Jews and Gentiles within the Jesus movement in Jerusalem. So we already know by the time chapter 6 gets here that Luke is telling us that there are Gentiles within the Jesus movement. And this dispute came up over the deacons who were taking food to the people. And again, this is a community ethic thing, a social ethic that's important to Luke. Where the deacons who were administering this food ministry, they were making sure Jewish widows were taken care of, but it looks like they were neglecting Gentile widows. And Luke really, shows how these early believers navigated some of that space to answer some of those issues about it. So early on, you already get this Gentile issue, like what do you do with Gentiles? At the same time, what do you do with Jewish rejection? So Luke is rehashing a lot of the issues that we've already talked about in a lot of the other writings. And so you can tell that the incorporation of the Gentiles and the fading of the Jewishness of the Jesus movement, you can see how important that was in early Christianity. It's in almost every writing of the New Testament. So you go from that kind of alleviating the problems related to Gentiles and Jews among the widows and food ministry to this plot against Stephen. The event ends in chapter 7 with the stoning of Stephen and the beginning of the local persecution. So Stephen does his big speech, and it's at that speech that he angers a large crowd, and they stone him to death. And that is the beginning. According to Luke, this is when a major movement towards the spreading of the gospel of Jesus Christ outside of Jerusalem. It's that people were leaving afraid they would be persecuted, and this is the initial movement beyond Jerusalem happens in chapter 8. Now that's fascinating because the whole gospel of Luke is temple and Jerusalem centric. So Jerusalem is the centerpiece for throughout the Gospel of Luke. And then when you get into the Acts, it gets all the way to chapter 8 before the Gospel goes beyond Jerusalem. And so the next section, chapter 9 through 12, talks about the persecution, this local persecution to the spreading of the gospel to the Gentiles. And so here's a short map, a real easy, accessible map to talk about how that spread. So early on in chapter 2, it talks about all these people who were there at Pentecost in Jerusalem that witnessed the Holy Spirit come down like fire, and people spoke in different languages. Well, that initially those people tended to go home. Now, it doesn't expressly say that, but it's certainly strongly indicated that that's what's happened. So in chapter 2, you get this preview of how the gospel is going to spread, and you see that that's indicated by the green lines on this map. The orange line is very short, the two lines going north. That's how it spread after Stephen's death. But notice the red line. Paul spreads the good news. The red line shows Paul's movement within Acts. So Paul is certainly, we noticed in his own writings he considered himself an apostle to the Gentiles. Well, Luke tells that same story, but Luke never calls him an apostle. For Luke, apostleship is only for those who are eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ. So while Luke tends to be very Paul-centric, he's a mediating voice. He doesn't give Paul all the credit that Paul claims for himself, and we'll see that later in the Jerusalem Council. But Paul does loom large in Luke's Acts of the Apostle. So the beginning of this is Paul's revelation. This is a Caravaggio painting of the revelation to Paul when he has his vision of Christ. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that he was knocked off his horse that is depicted here in this scene. But I love this painting because it really does kind of capture the intensity of that moment. So Saul, Luke tells us that he was originally called Saul. Paul never says that I know of. On the way to breeding these persecutions, he has this revelation, and some people call it a conversion. But Christianity wasn't a thing. It wasn't anything more than a way to be Jewish when Paul has this revelation. So Paul's conversion is not really a conversion from one religion to another. It is a transformation in the way he understands his own Jewishness, but also the way he understands how that's communicated beyond him. So that's important. But this is chapter 9. Paul has this revelation, so we know that Paul is going to be important for us. This also is important because Luke retells the story twice. He has Paul himself redescribing his experience on the way to Damascus later on, I think in chapter 22 and chapter 28. So this is an important point for the Acts of the Apostle. Paul's transformation, the revelation of Christ to Paul, looms large in the Acts of the Apostles. And he has it before, and this is important, Acts 10 through 12. While Paul has already been transformed, according to Acts, it's really Peter's vision of the unclean animals and his response to Cornelius, this Roman, that is the initial conversion of Gentiles. While it's assumed back in earlier chapters where there are Gentile widows within the community receiving the food ministry, this is the first time Gentiles are converted. And it tells us exactly how they're converted. Peter gets this vision that God has deemed Gentiles clean, and they don't have to uh, follow certain aspects of the Jewish law. That's the point of Peter's vision. He sees the unclean animals come down, and God says, "Take and eat." And he says, "No, God, I've never eaten anything unclean." And God says, "What I have deemed clean, it is clean indeed. Take and eat." And it said that Peter refused 2 more times before finally accepting this vision. While at the same time, Cornelius has this revelation that he needs to hear about Jesus. And he sends for Peter to come to him. So Peter comes to him, and that's when the Holy Spirit comes to Gentiles. And so Peter is the gateway to Gentiles, incorporation of the Gentiles without law, according to Acts itself. Now, that's Paul doesn't say that Peter couldn't preach the gospel to Gentiles, but Paul says that Peter was an apostle to the Jews. He was an apostle to Gentiles. He says that in Galatians. So there's already kind of conflict with Acts and Paul's. And then Peter comes back and describes the conversion of the Gentiles in chapter 12, in chapter 11, and then chapter 12, it narrates Peter's imprisonment by Herod Antipas, his escape and his flight, and kind of the ruin of Herod. But Peter just kind of takes off and disappears. So, and he really kind of disappears for a lot of the rest of the narrative. This is Peter, up to now, this is really the story of Peter and Peter's sermons and preaching and vision. And now chapter 13 through 28 changes directions, really. And this is the start and story of Paul's missionary activity in Acts. Again, I got you a pretty simple map here outlining what that looks like. So the rest of the Acts is specific to Paul's travels. And here you see 13 through 20 is Paul, the churches that Paul started. Now, what's important in Luke that is different in Paul's own writings is that Luke has this pattern that Paul goes first, he goes to a new city, he goes to the synagogue, he preaches in the synagogue. Some people believe, but most people reject him and kick him out of the synagogue. And then he goes to the Gentiles and preaches the Gentiles. And then there's this huge, overwhelming response to the gospel among Gentiles. That's how Luke, that's the pattern of Paul's ministry in Luke. And that pattern of Paul's ministry is fundamentally different in Paul's own writings. So Luke is mediating Paul to his audience here. Paul never says that he ever went to a synagogue first. Paul never says that he ever preached to Jews. Paul only understood his calling as a calling to Gentiles. He felt that the revelation of Christ sent him to Gentiles in his own ministry, in his own words. So there's an incredible discrepancy between Paul's model of ministry in Acts and Paul's model of ministry in his own writings. So back to Acts, you get all these churches that Paul started in these 7 chapters, 13 through 20, and then 21 through 27 narrates Paul his experience in Jerusalem. Now, chapter 15 is important because he comes back to Jerusalem there and defends his gospel at this church, at this Jerusalem council, where James is the main character. James is the one who makes the final decision on how things are supposed to be. And it's in that decision that James says that Gentiles have to follow 4 things to be followers of Jesus. So it's not just a law-free gospel, according to James. And in Paul, in Galatians, Paul says, the only thing they told me to do was remember the poor. So there are some major discrepancies between that meeting in Acts versus that meeting in Galatians, where Paul narrates for himself. And then chapter 21 through 27. 21, there's another visit to Jerusalem. And then Paul is in Jerusalem from 21 to 27. There he speaks to um, politicians, Greek politicians, and local Jerusalem politicians and Roman politicians. And then the Acts ends with Paul being sent off to Rome, which kind of sets up the whole narrative of Acts. Acts starts in Jerusalem in the first chapter with Jesus and ends in the last chapter with Paul going to Rome. So throughout the entire letter, there's a movement from Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria, to the rest of the world, and eventually to Rome. So that movement is incredibly important throughout the entire Acts of the Apostles. In the next video, I'll talk about some of the main themes that's important to note in Acts. But I hope this outline's been helpful to you. If you have any questions, just send me emails.